Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
A very, very good afternoon to the entire fraternity of the ICS webinars, as well as those who have now increasingly taken a shine to the ICS webinars because of their immense topicality and, of course, the brilliance of the speakers that we invite to speak and discuss various matters. Just 3 points before we get into the actual proceedings. The first is, of course, that I was technically not the person to moderate this discussion today. Ambassador Ashok Kanta was, the director was to do this, but to those who are unaware, he underwent a really, really horrible series of tragedies. He first lost his mother last week, and then his sister, elder sister, who had come down from Lucknow to take part in the last rites, unfortunately for still some reasons, but she was not too well, but suddenly took a turn for worse, and she too departed. So understandably, Ambassador Kant is rather devastated by this turn of events, and so he asked me to come in his place. The second thing is that, as you all know, we have as our media partners on this ICS Wednesday webinars, ThePrint, and it is really this joint partnership which has also provided a huge boost to these discussions and talks, and in this partnership we are able to enlarge the scope of our audiences considerably, and as someone just informed us, we are also now live streaming on YouTube. The third thing is just housekeeping by way of the proceedings of this webinar. The speaker will speak for about 40 minutes, and thereafter the floor will be open for questions. As the chat has already put a little text out there that all of you will be muted during the presentation by the speaker, and the chat box will be open, and so you are free to keep writing your questions on the chat box. Of course, when the question answer session opens, we will invite the people to ask their questions as well. Or you could use the raise hand option, and then once the question answer session begins, I can see the hand and invite you to make your point or question. So with those basic housekeeping instructions, let me say that it is with the greatest of pleasure that I that I invite Professor Raja Mohan to speak on the subject. The speaker needs no introduction at all, and he has already been saying hello to the entire gang before we started. So that's not necessary. We save time on that. And the subject also does not require any introductory remarks from the chair. What we need is really a talk which will help us clarify some of the questions, burning questions, may I add, in India today, since the Sino-US relationship and equally the Sino-Indian relationship has become an extremely, are both poised at extremely critical junctures at this point of time. But it is really the larger picture that we will be looking at through the lecture that Raj will give, and then come down to how that larger picture is really going to affect very specific questions before Indian security, strategic and foreign policy today. So without any more ado, over to you, and let's start.
So I'm really so sorry to hear about Ambassador Kanta and his bereavement. So please convey my condolences to him. And it's again, I think it's happy to be back with Institute of Chinese Studies because my association goes back a long time. And most recently, last year, my institute, that is the Institute of South Asian Studies and ICS, we had organized a workshop on China's digital Silk Road. In fact, we had got participants from Europe and other places. CAS, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, supported it. And once we published that, the monograph out of those papers presented there, it's got a fantastic reception across the world. And I think the timing was good. And many of the issues raised in that report, which is on the tech-related issues, whether it was 5G, China's general digital expansion, and India's own digital exposure to China. Those are the issues that were highlighted. And as we can see, those have all been, come into play in a fundamental way today. But my objective really is to talk about Asian geopolitics, the larger questions. I'm not wading into the India-China relationship. I'm sure you all have been doing quite a bit on that. But of course, in terms of the consequences of what's happening in the relationship between US and China, its impact on the Asian geopolitics, and what it means for India, of course, quite happy to, we can have a discussion. But so my focus is on the larger picture in Asia. I think sitting in Singapore, where we monitor this quite closely, I think I can bring something extra for all our friends in Delhi. Before we go further into the question of Asian geopolitics, let me offer a couple of caveats, which is really that we are in, I think very few people will disagree with the proposition that we are at an inflection point in Asia and Asia's evolution. There are major discontinuities in the region's geopolitics that are staring at us. But it will be a bold man who can predict how exactly this will play out. So I'm not going to try and predict where we are going. So my purpose, I think, is really to make a judgment or an assessment by looking at some broader structural changes that are taking place, rather than saying specifically where it is going. So I think, like all of us professionals in diplomats or strategic analysts, or it's really making judgments or assessments based on limited knowledge, and that you don't know where the future is. So therefore, there is always uncertainty. So those who are looking for clarity, I might seek apology from them that they're not going to be absolute clarity in terms of where exactly we're going. But I think the challenge for us in Asia today is to understand the complexity, the fluidity that has emerged, and to reflect on the multiple possibilities that might emerge as we look ahead. What I thought I'll do is really to look at 5 big structural issues in the region, and then we can then go into a bit of discussion on what it means for India, and then we can go into the question answer session. So the first thing I want to highlight is really the economic dimension of the US-China relationship. I think in India, we are so focused on the politics of it that I think we often underestimate the extraordinary transformation of the US-China relationship on the economic side, commercial side, over the last 4 decades and more. So this really, whichever way you look at it, that's what has underwritten a whole lot of things in Asia, and the extraordinary durability of the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the United States. So the question, I think the big question which we need to explore is really, has the economic integration of China and the United States, has it passed the peak? Is the essential economic nature of US-China relationship, which is deep and very, very expansive, is that beginning to fall apart, weaken, or you can choose our respective adjectives. But I think fundamentally, the question is, have we passed the peak? And if there is going to be a significant change, what does it mean for us? And I think last few months have been quite surprising for most of us. But I'm sure that we're not done yet, and there are going to be even more surprises. So I think just stepping back and looking at what US-China economic relationship has meant. 1970s, of course, we're familiar with the political normalization that took place, but it's really the expansion of the economic relationship in the 1980s. And that survived the 1989, the end of the Cold War and the Tiananmen events. And the initial ideological tilt in Beijing at the time, in 89-90, was kind of buried, shall we say, by Deng, who went to the so-called Southern Tour in 1992 February, which I think created conditions for a dramatic expansion of the Chinese US-China economic relationship. As many of you know, I mean, that when he said leftism is a bigger danger than rightism, and that the integration and reform and opening up of China will continue. That's when the real takeoff of China began, and the expansive nature of the relationship, the foundations of it were laid. But to summarize, I mean, I think it's a long story, and most of you are familiar with it. What did it do, the US-China economic relationship? I think it provided the basis for building red capitalism, if you will, in China, where the CCP has dramatically transformed the Chinese economy, 4 decades of extraordinary growth that all of us are familiar with. Less understood, I think, is really the boost that China gave to global capitalism. That it was not just about building China, but by becoming the world's factory and becoming an attractive destination for Western capital, that you created a whole new boost to global capitalism that looked weak and anemic in the 1970s. So the transformation of a large sized market that was open for Western investments and of an export-oriented strategy that produced conditions for an unprecedented expansion of global capitalism that took place. Of course, the US-China economic engagement, I mean, finished and destroyed the Soviet Union, if you will, certainly divided and defeated Asian communism in a fundamental way because of the impact of what that had on other communist parties in the region. That again, in India, we are quite familiar. More interestingly, of course, it promoted the China-US normalization and economic integration, provided the basis for Asia's economic integration. That is, if you think of the rest of the region, much of it, already Japan, Korea, the Four Tigers, later the ASEAN, all had deep relationship with the West. And when West and China got together or were on the same side, then I think it provided even a deeper basis for Asia's economic integration. So I think Asian economic integration would not have been imaginable without the Sino-US economic partnership. And of course, it also restored, in a historical sense, China's centrality in the Asian domain. And I think that, again, is a fact all of you know. So the question today then that brings me back to the question that is this relationship breaking down? What we've seen in the last few months, certainly in the last, since 2018, when President Trump launched his trade war against China, and the tariffs that have been put, and the whole shakedown that had begun, and more recently, the attempted digital, decoupling that the United States is trying with China. So these are certainly new elements, and I think for decades, both the capital in China, capital in the United States, took whatever the other problems that were there, that the flows of capital trade was beneficial for both, and that this was going to be, it's not going to, it's going to be a permanent feature, just as we all believed globalization was irreversible. So the US-China economic relationship, founded on a neoliberal economics, open borders, easy movement of capital, and greater digital and technological collaboration, would be a permanent feature, I think. So this was taken for granted while people did notice political and other differences. But now I think what has happened in the last 2 years is certainly the nature of the economic relationship. That is what is fundamentally shifting. And I think that is the key, how this plays out, rather than the political issues. So this is going to be the most important one. Here, that takes me to the second set of issues, that is that how this economic relationship will move between US and China is tied to the shifting domestic politics in the United States as well as in China. I think in the US, China is part of the bigger questioning today of globalization, the benefits of globalization, a debate that began from 2016 election, and it continues today in different forms. So the question of China is central to the debate, the discourse in the United States on the future of globalization, on the future of open borders, on the future of trade, and of course the digital rules of governance. So that, and you all would know more about what's happening inside China. So US too, it would be shocking if it is not the main issue that's being debated in China today. So therefore, it's not just that it's become a major political issue, the nature of the economic relationship with the other, but the politics in the two countries will influence the dynamic in the other. So I think that is a condition that is going to make it a lot more harder, because we not only have to understand the domestic politics of both, but also see how they interconnected. Now, in China, I mean, I think I don't want to go into that because you all know more about it. But certainly, what seems to be happening in the last few days, from my limited understanding of economics and of China's domestic debates, what I do see is the pandemic, the trade war, the supply line disruption is some impact on how Chinese reflect on the political economy of China. There seems to be a new theory that is seemed to be making rounds, which is called the dual circulation theory. That is, in the past, the emphasis was on international circulation, that is that export-oriented strategy. But today, that seems to be complemented by an internal circulation argument that China needs to rely more on itself amidst the kind of economic warfare that the US has launched, and it's mobilizing its other allies into the battle. So the emphasis on internal market, I mean, is really somewhat, you can say, it is the Chinese version of, shall we say, Atmanirbhar. But, of course, that scale and the consequences are going to be very, very different. That's one theme. The other theme, of course, is the political centralization under Xi's leadership, what it might produce, and there are a whole range of debates. But the interesting phrase, I'm sure all of you would, recent Politburo meeting on July 30th, I think, pointed to the long-term and the medium-term challenges that China faces, and that this is going to be a protracted warfare or something to that effect, essentially invoking these days, Mao is back, the notion that this is not a settlement that's going to happen tomorrow, but it's going to be a protracted contest on how China must address its economic issues internally and externally. So this is quite a significant change that has taken place, and I think we got to pay a lot of attention to those debates within. Second, in the US, the debate is out there in the open; it's much easier to track, and the argument, as I said, is not just about China, but it's about globalization in general, and that there is a pushback against the globalization of the last 4 decades, which summarize the argument, benefited the American capital, but has it benefited the American labor and the rest of the society? And this is an argument that Bernie Sanders raised in 2016. Trump cashed in on it. And today we see that idea is back. And I think it is a central theme in the US elections this year. I think we need to pay a lot more attention to that. That as it goes, socialism is not a bad word in the United States. In 1992, I mean, Clinton won on the ground saying that he's not a liberal. Today, Bernie Sanders is a self-avowed socialist. And the kind of arguments that are being put forward for more role of state, the return of industrial policy, if you read the Democratic Party's manifesto, and of course, the state is dishing out money in the pandemic. So the return of the role of the state and the question of how the distributional aspects of American economy or back. And I think how much of it will it have an impact? Is Biden merely pretending to be with the change, or I mean, how far will he go in adapting to the pressures from the left, if you will, the left of the kind that America has, but it's certainly far more powerful today. So I think what you have is Biden is moving to the left on the many issues his positions that he has taken, and I think this produces conditions for a very different American economic policy that on trade, for example, Bernie Sanders' position and a position of Trump is not very different. And Biden himself is promising he's not going to sign any more free trade treaties without huge safeguards for the American workers and on the environmental conditions. So those of us in India, we worry all the time about Americans imposing globalization on us. But it's a very, very different debate that is taking place in the US, that the losers from globalization in the United States are pushing the agenda and demanding a fundamental change in the way the US deals with the rest of the world. So it is on free trade agreements, on visas, on open border. All these have become big domestic issues in the United States. So that takes us to the question, look, how do different segments of the US deal with this problem? So that is, if the US is in a churn, domestic churn, what does it do? For example, historically, the US business has been the biggest champion of the China relationship. But today it's divided, I think. Many of them still think it's foolish to break from China, or decoupling is not possible. But a lot of them also see problems in terms of the intellectual property, the Chinese making China strategy, etc. The tech companies, of course, have been just like Wall Street, Silicon Valley has been a big, big lover of China. You saw all these companies really were really, even when they were kept out on a number of areas, the very size of the Chinese market they continue to engage China. But now, if we saw what William Barr was, Attorney General was saying a few days ago, that warning them, look, you not going to do what you feel like with China. There are larger American interests involved. And I think the tension is what will determine a lot of things, how this plays out. Hollywood, I remember Richard Gere, lover of Tibet, was always radical. Hollywood is taking positions from Darfur to every other issue in the world. But when it comes to China these days, they're mum. Mum is the word, because the size of the Chinese market today, Hollywood has gone quiet on China. There was a time when they would criticize everything in the world except China. So I think that, again, tells you the power of the Chinese market and what it is doing to different institutions in the US. US Congress is the movement is on the other side. There is increasingly an hostile mode in the US Congress to China across the board, from left and right. The deep state, meanwhile, has, if you will, among the 4 people who made the speeches against China last few days, was the FBI director. So this is all of you know this state, any state, when you have the domestic intelligence beginning to take positions, it is partly given the power of FBI in the United States. So I think you have actually the Pentagon, the FBI, the establishment, that level, the deep state has moved to a hostile position. But that will have to be set against the logic on the political side. For example, there is a case for engagement. I mean, just as we engage China, even under the what goes on in Ladakh, there is a powerful section which says, look, we can't abandon engagement with China. Even Trump, they're having talks on trade next week, August 15th. So he's not giving up his hopes for a trade deal. So those talks need to do something with China. And I'm sure we've seen some signs of the Chinese too, that they don't want, for all the bravado, they don't want a collapse of the US relationship. So I think there will be some attempt. Then the question of global issues. For example, during the Cold War, the détente was based on the proposition the US needs to engage China because of the nuclear issue. While they had problems on a whole lot of other things, there were global issues on which Soviet Union and US needed to cooperate. Today, if you read the Democratic Party's platform, the emphasis on climate change means here is global governance issues, nuclear proliferation, North Korea, these issues have become the justification for we must continue to engage China. So in the United States. So I think while Biden has to pretend at least he's tough on China, he has to take positions, at the same time, which was the progressives in the party too are putting pressure. So that's why if you read the manifesto that has come out yesterday or so, it says, look, we don't want a Cold War. Of course, we'll raise the issues of human rights and a whole lot of economic issues, but we don't want a Cold War. So I think there is a variation in the Trump and the Biden positions. How that plays out is going to be a complex play. But what we can be certain, if there are any things we can be certain, is that there is going to be no going back to the honeymoon of the last 4 decades. So there will be a continuous tension, and the metaphor of protracted warfare or protracted adjustment or protracted contestation between US and China on the economic domain is there for a long time. And I think that brings me to the third set of issues, which is really the military security. I'll try and shorten the presentation a little bit from now on. It is the question of that, how did China deal with the US-led security order after 1945? It's quite fascinating and how different it is from India's experience. So I'm putting myself up. I don't have a bulletproof jacket, but I'm quite willing to take criticism on this one. Essentially, while India made such a strong critique of, Nehru's time onwards, the Seato, Cento, Pakistan's 1954 agreement with the United States, which kind of continued right till 2005, if I remember correctly. Every arms sale from US to China was a big political issue in India, big, contestation with the American. But if you look at the Chinese, how dramatically they've transformed, unlike India, which really hardly saw American military presence on its borders. China had lived with American military presence for the last 7 decades in Japan, in relationship in Korea, Taiwan, Philippines. Of course, a lot of it is varied, but the fact that China lived with American military alliances and propositions right on its border, a scale of challenge that China faced with American military when American military was at its peak after the Second World War is kind of, and the way they've handled it is so different from how we had become so nervous and anxious about it. If you say, look, 4 phases of how China has dealt with this China's US military alliances. 50s and 60s, it was contestation. In fact, there was a Korean War. There was the Sumamatsu crisis. There was a frequent jockeying, fighting in the Chinese waters between the American and the Chinese. 1970s and 80s, there was a kind of, okay, I will find ways of even working because the Soviet Union became the enemy. So how China thought about tilting to one side, to the other side this time. In fact, if I might just digress a bit, that maybe Ambassador Nambiar and others will know this. I mean, when the American, meetings between Nixon and Kissinger, I mean, the public denunciation of American military alliances in Asia, that was part of the standard trope for the Chinese in the 50s. But in the conversations, at least Mao Zedong was supposed to have said, look, we don't mind you being here because you're a cap on Japanese militarism. That is, American military presence in Japan was a cap on Japanese militarism. And therefore, when overall political relationship improves, you're not making a first principle issue of American military presence in Asia. So the logic question is, do you have a political understanding of what are the principal threats? And if you have that, you can navigate. So it really was not a great issue in the 1970s and 80s. It became less of importance. And in the 90s and 2000s, as China became stronger, it was still willing to acquiesce in American forward military presence. But in the last decade, we've seen a systematic effort by the Chinese at weakening American military alliances. And I think that is the transformation. Today, the whole big debate in Asia is really, are American alliances sustainable? And here, the 3 broad issues, I think here, which are being debated. Does a framework that was designed to counter the Soviet Union, an alliance system, Does it have the capacity to work against China, especially given 4 decades of intense economic cooperation between US and China? And once China was made kosher by the United States, the rest of Asia joined the party, and everybody's been having fun in the larger economic cake that got produced. So can this framework survive China's rise? I think that is the central question, and I think the answers can be multiple. The second tension is American military presence, as we said, for 70 years in China's front yard. How does it stack up against China's growing military power? So if you look at those debates, clearly the Chinese, whether Americans can continue to stay in the so-called First Island chain, as China's land-based missile force, growing submarines. There was a time when Americans could just come, buzz the Chinese whichever way they wanted. So the risks of Americans confronting China in China's front yard are grown. But of course, we've seen Americans have tried different tactics, whether they'll work or not. But the fact is, the expansion of Chinese military power raises fundamental questions about American forward military presence, and how that plays out is going to be the great story. And then this has political consequences, which is the alliances. Can the alliance, the presence of China as the principal economic partner for all the countries, including the US allies, Japan downwards, what does it do to the alliances in the region? So I see at least there is alignment, de-alignment, realignment that is taking place. And I think it's quite fascinating. I mean, Korea is supposed to be an ally of the United States. But if you look at their attitudes to China, I think fundamentally different. So that you can say that is de-alignment. You can see some countries which are not close to the US before are willing to do more things with the US, like certainly India does it, Indonesia does a little bit, Vietnam does quite a bit with the Americans these days. And then there is the shifting of this whole game. I think it's not a single story anymore, that different countries, Thailand is supposed to be the oldest American ally, but the Thai relationship with China makes it fundamentally a different situation. So what you have is actually a profound pressure, I think, on the structure of what we saw were the permanent kind of structures of the US alliances. And on top of it, you have the whole range of new issues that are coming up in Hong Kong. So all the understandings between America and China, back in the period of normalization, going back to the 1979 Declaration on Taiwan, on the question of Hong Kong, on the question of how US would treat the CCP as a. So now we're beginning to see Pompeo using the term regime, the delegitimization of this China as a state, and this president is being called Secretary General. So you have actually this, of course, it's not everyone in the US does it, but the fact is a section of the establishment today is dealing with this issue in a fundamentally different way. And then you have the big fat maritime issue of how the law of the sea, what does it mean for the region, and China's own assertive policies. Can the US do something about it? So you have actually quite a troubling situation that is beginning to emerge, and what it does to the region is extraordinary. That brings me to the fourth set of issues, which is the regional institutions. I live in ASEAN. Everybody loves ASEAN here. Everybody loves ASEAN. ASEAN centrality. But there is a problem out here that ASEAN's emergence of ASEAN centrality was the consequence of a geopolitical vacuum in Asia in the 60s and later in the 70s. That you had actually post-war, in the post-war settlement, Japan, which was the dominant power in Asia, was put down, defanged, made a non-military power. Then you had China turned inwards with its civil war, and India that opted out of Asia. So it produced a large vacuum in the heart of East Asia, and ASEAN became the platform that would initially for self-defense and regional integration, and now after 90, it became the big institution to bring all the major powers in, bring everybody together, promote regional economic integration, create like ARF and East Asia Summit that would produce security. But then once you have a big magnet, a big power next door, can ASEAN survive Chinese power? That is the question. I think not many talk about it openly, but the fact is what Chinese power does to the ASEAN coherence, what ASEAN has or has not done vis-a-vis South China Sea issue. So it tells you when you have a big power next door, you don't speak up like you do. I mean, that I think is a fundamental change. This is what power does, but there it is. And China is setting up its own institutions, the BRI, the IB. So you have actually the ASEAN centrality is overshadowed by the rise of China and China's extraordinary economic and military clout today, and political influence, which is, we tend to underestimate that in all the countries of East Asia. So what are the possibilities for the regional order in terms of? So I would say three possibilities. One, a China-centric regional order is well on its way. When the RCEP was signed, it looked like that it was one that consolidates, legitimizes the China-centered regional economic integration. But of course, India walking out of it, has raised all questions. And now the Americans questioning China's role. RCEP is not a deep integration, but nevertheless, will it hold? Or it actually now, because very few countries can really break away from China, would RCEP and China-led regional economic integration continue to take place, or will there be changes? The second scenario I would see is a fragmented regional order. As the US-China contest becomes serious, that's going to fragment both regional institutions as well as in a more geographic sense. Already some people in the region in here talk about the continental Asia increasingly aligning with China, sucked into the great Chinese orbit, and the maritime nations drawing closer to the US, constructing new partnerships. So that's one imaginary, but that's again, I think it's worth debating that. And then you have the prospect for a US-China accommodation. Because G2 was a thing. I mean, I don't think that ever disappears. I mean, this idea that great powers will make accommodations. And we saw in the Cold War, we saw in the 19th century, there's a continuous contestation as well as continuous accommodation. So what is the nature of that accommodation? The Americans talked about a responsible stakeholder. Now, Chinese don't believe that. The Chinese talked about a new type of great power relations. So the problem of accommodation is not the principle. It is the terms. What are whose terms? And what are the terms of accommodation? But at least now we see the terms that the Americans are setting, at least in the current administration, are far more stringent, raises questions about China's legitimacy. So I think it's a no-no for the Chinese. So it could just simply break down. But I think the pressure, assuming a Biden administration comes, or if somebody else is there, that they need to continue to engage China. I mean, I think there's no escaping, given the size of China, given its weight in the global issues, regional issues, you can't simply say, I'm going to switch this off. So I think the tension between the growing problems with China and the continuing necessity to engage China, I think will be playing a large role. So I'll just come to the last couple of points, which is really the question, I think, for all of us in Asia is really, how does the tension between Chinese power and Asian nationalism play out? This, I think, while on the one hand, you could say, look, the Chinese have become so powerful that most national elites are beginning to compromise, or at least they're divided deeply from Japan to India, if I must say. There is a deep division among the elites. Do we accommodate the Chinese or do we resist the Chinese? I think that fragmentation of the national elites is real. And I think is a consequence of the power of China and its centrality in the region. So there's no escaping the fragmentation. I think it depends on the coherence of the elites. So if you see Philippines today, the president said, look, forget the ICJ, or not ICJ, PCA judgment on South China Sea. It's better to be friends of China rather than try to argue with China. But the military, it continues to question that line of argument. So you have one country, fragmented elite that is looking at the China problem in fundamentally different ways. So I think this problem will not disappear. So this debate is not within Asia, but in each country of Asia, the problem of dealing with China becomes a very important one. But the bigger question is, look, does Asian nationalism simply surrender to the Chinese power? Just as Chinese are so proud of themselves, Asia has matured. Everybody has an identity of their own. And these are not small countries. Indonesia, 250 plus. Philippines is 100 million, close to Vietnam is 80, Thai is 80. So these are not small countries that are simply going to fold up. So while the ruling section might want to compromise, there will be others in the internecine fights would take positions that to mobilize nationalism. So I think we must expect that if there's one ideology that has survived across Asia in the last many decades, is the nationalist idea. Sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. And I think the Chinese have a problem dealing with the rest of Asia's nationalism. Just as they assume that they can mobilize Asian nationalism in the past against the West. Today, if Americans are smart, if they align with Asian nationalist sentiment, they can actually turn the tables around. But because Americans have been too internationalist to seize nationalist opportunities, but nationalism is not going to disappear in Asia. And I think the tussle between a rising hegemon and the Asian nationalism, I think, will continue in some form. So, just I'll conclude with a brief comment on India. If you see the historical, we talked about 5 issues: the nature of globalization and its potential for decoupling, the shifting domestic coalitions, the pressures on the US alliance system, the pressures on regional institutions, and the role of nationalism. Within this, I think, what does India do? I mean, I'll just make 2 general remarks. And one is, I think we need to be absolutely be realist in this. I think for too long, our imagination of Asia was colored by idealism and romanticism. And I think today we are going to be in the middle of, like 19th century Europe, a brutal realpolitik that's going to play itself out. And to deal with it, we have to be utterly realistic and in cold and calculated in making judgments about the shifting of power equations in the region and what they mean for the region as a whole and for us. And if you look at India's Asian policy, there have been 3 great initiatives. The Asianist idea in the interwar period that became part of India's nationalism, the idea that Asia is one, which was a great, starting with Tagore downwards. But then when the war broke out, we presented the rest of Asia with 2 armies, the Indian army fighting with the British, and the British Indian army, and then we had Subhas Bose fighting with the Japanese against the British. So, and the Indian elite was fragmented because there was the Congress, which was non-aligned. The Bose went with the Japanese. You had the communists who initially said it was inter-imperialist war, said we'll support the war. So you saw how a shifting great power dynamic cracked Indian elite in such a deep way that we've struggled to overcome that. I think the consequence of that, that's a different story. We can do it for another day. The second is post-independence notions of Asian solidarity through Asian Relations Conference. I see no other idea has been so romanticized as the Asian Relations Conference. And by bonding time, of course, we just turned our back and moved away. Then we went back in Lookie's policy in 1992, 93, 94. And now you ended up walking out of RCEP. And we're still not a great player out there in terms of the regional security arrangement. So it just tells you 3 times we've imagined a larger role, a larger contribution, yet each time the results have been deeply either failure or disappointment. But I think this is something, this is not to cast a judgment on anyone, but I think we have to reflect on our own past with a measure of realism rather than simply repeating to ourselves the story as if there's a great Asian idea. I think, and then therefore, I think India's relative strength has certainly grown. Undivided India was a powerful force in Asia. I think finally Indian resources mattered to the outcome of the war. Then India turned its back, went into a shell, but today India's relative capabilities are strong enough. But the question is, can those be deployed in an effective way for the regional constructing a different order. So while India's strength has grown, like the last, we can still find ourselves strangely out of it, as we are out of RCEP, as we are out of most of the big picture security issues in the region. So I'll stop here, Alka. Hope not provoked you too much.
No, not at all. I think, thank you very much. I think it's been a very comprehensive picture indeed about the structural shifts. But let's say I was somewhat gladdened by the fact that you returned a bit to your good old JNU days in your discourse, which began with literally positing economics as the concentrated expression of politics. So that's where things begin. That's where you start your analysis. I have 2 or 3 questions, but as per tradition, the first question goes to our media partner, ThePrint. And
I'm here.
Hi. Right. Yeah, please go ahead and get your question in.
Okay. Thanks so much, Alka and Dr. Raja Mohan. Wonderful to see you again. You can't see me?
No, I can see you. I can hear you loud and clear.
Good. That makes 2 of us.
Yeah.
Okay. 2 very quick questions. The first is on RCEP, and you are, like you said, the ultimate realist. So do you think India should have joined RCEP? You know the argument that India would have been overwhelmed by cheap Chinese goods. You already have a huge trade deficit. So that's the first question. If you'd like to answer it now, and I can wait to ask my second one.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was merely noting the fact that we have stepped out of RCEP. Whatever reasons, I think quite clearly the reason, whether it's cited explicitly or not, was about China. That we can't continue to be part of a China-led economic integration that has been costly. Therefore, I think that political judgment is quite clear. So I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, but that bridge has been crossed. So the question today is, do we do bilateral deals? Do we do other trade deals? Because even there's questioning of a lot of other trade deals as well. Last few days, Indian newspapers, we've talked about ASEAN-related trade deals being used to push in Chinese goods. So I think there are cautions, there is countermeasures being taken. But the fundamental question is the assumptions about that world is integrating, trade is good. I think that is being challenged. And in the US, in India, and probably in other places in Britain. So I think you are actually at a fundamental point. The WTO is in a crisis. What kind of an economic arrangements will come? I think if India continues to do bilateral deals with other powers, key economic actors, US, Japan, Europe, and others, you'll still be a trade actor. Some people will say, look, why do I need a FTA? I can do a trade. My market is so good, I can do it, provided the right conditions. So I think we are at a very interesting point in India's evolution because the assumptions made in 90 are being reversed. That's been a political decision. The consequence of it, what we do, how we do it, I think that is a debate. I think we are in a new phase.
Right. Thank you. That's very interesting. My second question is again picking up on your realist positions and vis-a-vis in between India and China. Nobody talks about the Dalai Lama, and everybody believes that he should be he should stay in his little ashram in Dharamshala. What would you say? Do you think that that he should remain there, or should India be much more active about within quotes using him?
Look, I think it's whether they call it a card, whatever it is. I mean, I think what we've seen happen in the last few years, certainly last few weeks, is every issue is back on the table. Hollywood might not be interested in Tibet anymore, but American ambassador went to Tibet office in Delhi. There are pictures of it, and that was not. It's on the Twitter. Ambassador Jester was sitting in Tibet office. You have tomorrow the Health and Human Affairs Secretary in US is traveling to Taiwan. The Xinjiang is a big issue in the US. So I think those issues are up there. I mean, now how it plays out is something that we have to see. That what were kind of finessed or put aside during the era of US-China bonhomie, today those issues are out there. I mean, that is the fact on the ground. What we do with it, of course, it's a different story. I see that they were talk about India kind of finding more space in its one China policy and not be blindly. Within one China policy, there are more things to be done with Taiwan and others. So I think we have a debate. So I would say this is just as India-China relationship has entered a complicated moment. I would think all these issues will come up in some form or the other.
No, but you're not answering the question. The question was, of course, India is expanding its space and wants to go beyond its one China policy, and you mentioned Taiwan. But my question is about the Dalai Lama, and I'm asking you what you think. You're refusing to answer that question, and that's my interest.
One of the things I've learned in journalism is you don't have to answer all questions.
Yeah, so let's hear you.
But I like to hear all the experts in the room.
Dr. Raja Mohan.
No. I look forward to seeing the debate on the one China, two China policy.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have roughly 35 minutes or so for a Q&A. And let me just kick off. There are quite a few questions which have come up, but let me kickstart the process. Two issues that appear to me coming out of your talk. The first is that this whole question of, the end of the US-China honeymoon, it appears to me that there was never any honeymoon in that sense of the term. It was China's accommodation, and as you yourself have put it, in the how they basically adjusted to the US-led security order, to the US-led economic engagements, alliances, whatever, and essentially were biding their time. But when you say that going back onto the honeymoon, it appears almost as if there was a kind of a halcyon phase, and I think this contestation was always there, and it was again a structural issue, that the fact that China simply did not have the wherewithal to stand up to the United States. And so now the logic of this changing power is coming into the Sino-US equation. So there, I mean, how would you see that? That's the first thing. But the second question is related to the Asian context, where you are saying that we are seeing two kinds of trends, and the first issue is about the problem of the elite fragmentation. And how, therefore, it will be very difficult to actually cobble a cohesive policy towards China, given this fragmentation. But yet you are talking about the power of nationalism. And now these two are contradictory kind of forces. I mean, if you are saying that nationalism will eventually become a major force in these countries to deal with China, then what happens to the elite fragmentation? And the elite fragmentation is very real. We are seeing that across Asia. So would not that be inhibiting the kind of nationalism to emerge in any kind of cohesive? And finally, these domestic pressures. I think the question about that honeymoon again has to do with the fact that how much are we reading into this end of the honeymoon? Because till 5 months ago, you had Trump, who was taking a very, very, very different line on China, and then you have suddenly things unraveling pretty fast. So again, I come back to how do we understand this US-China relationship? The last 5 months really do not make sense to me, frankly, and I see that. Okay, I'll leave those two at that. So maybe you can come in and then we can take in all the questions.
Since you're from JNU and there's a Marxist pedagogy and Mao himself, I think there is a principal contradiction. What is the principal contradiction? I think what we saw, there were continuous political issues between US and China when Kissinger went to China in 1971 and Nixon went in 1972. There were always issues, human rights, there's that, Tiananmen, sanctions, non-proliferation. but the economic relationship, the deepening economic relationship, that's what I meant honeymoon, that the extraordinary economic integration that took place between the two provided a stabilizing element to the political differences, and that more and more of the American capital saw the engagement with China was profitable, and that must be maintained at reasonable cost. So that produced a huge stabilizing element. And I think what's happening today, as I said, look, questioning globalization itself and the backlash against globalization in the US is threatening that order. So you can say maybe there will be reaccommodation. Maybe Trump is still talking about a political, a trade deal. In fact, yesterday he was on Fox News talking about, oh, Xi Jinping used to be my good friend, but after what he did to me on pandemic, I don't, but trade deal, if they can buy corn, that will help me in my election. So there again, I would say go back to the classical interpretation of, so go by the economic interests of different sections of the elite. So Trump's national security strategy says China and Russia are principal threats. There's return of the great power rivalry, but he says, look, he wants to deal with the Russians, he wants to deal with the Chinese. So that's his personal conviction. So like, that in India, I mean, not everybody doesn't speak in the same voice. So I think that's part of life, right? I mean, that if international politics were an algorithm, you and I will be out of business. So I think it is the pressures on the old politics, the emergence of new contradictions is what is creating this confused picture. But you can identify a deeper analysis. I mean, whose interests are what? Like you saw the hearing, the four tech giants include, Apple, Google, Amazon, and Facebook. So they were asked specifically, did you have any problem with your intellectual property theft? I didn't hear that, sir, Tim Cook said. I've heard about it, but my company did not face it. So you see, I mean, but tomorrow, if the deep state begins to tell them, look, guys, enough is enough, there is going to be a new set of rules. So I think there again, we assume somehow the capital is independent of the state. It is not. So in the end, they are American companies. They have to deal with American state and its interests. So how that plays out internally, that's why I said, we must look at domestic politics, how multiple groups are dealing with it. And I think that's what will hold the answers. So that was my principal burden. Same on the nationalism side. So both the things are real. Philippines, they almost abandoned the American agreement. The army said, no, we're not abandoning. This guy said, look, put aside the PCA judgment of 2016. Let's be nice to the Chinese and the Chinese will be nice to us. That hasn't stopped his problem on the South China Sea. So I think this is going to be part of life. And I think our challenge for analysis for people like us is to be able to put this into a picture where we make sense of it. But I know there's at least having been through a great internationalist phase in JNU, one thing you learned is nationalism is kicking in every corner of the world, including in the United States. So that, and China is not the only country that is nationalist. So you see it in India in the last few weeks. So I think that force will be there. I mean, who will mobilize it, how it will be mobilized, that is politics. And that's where the story will make it, we'll see the story, how it unfolds.
Okay, so let's now open up this to the participants. Now, in the interest of accommodating the large number of questions that have come up and some hands have also come up, let me request everybody to keep their questions short, to the point, not make any large kind of arguments.
You want to collect a few, or you want me to answer one?
So I'm going to first start with, we have Ambassador Kishan Rana in our institute, and one thing that he has dinned into all of us day in and day out is get the youngsters to start the questioning first. So while there are fairly senior people here, I am going to do the Kishan Rana route and ask Samanvay, who is from the ICS, to come up and get his question first. Samanvay, you're on.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll just keep the question very brief. Keeping in mind India's need to perhaps move closer to the US to deal with the Chinese threat, how do you think India should best balance its existing relationship with Russia, especially on matters relating to defense, and also move closer to the US? The possible pitfalls you see over there and how you think India should overcome them.
Okay. Ambassador Goyal, you had typed in your question pretty early, so you can put that in. Ambassador Goyal, are you on or have you departed?
I think he's left the meeting room, so we can perhaps ask someone else.
Okay, so we will then move
Alka, you can summarize some of the text, what has come in chat, if you want to summarize that.
Yeah, so no, since he's left, we shall skip on his question. And Ambassador Saurabh Kumar next.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you for.
Hi, Saurabh.
Hi. I have 3 questions. I will not touch on all of them because depending on time, only the first one. You'll see them in the chat. When you have time, please see, or chair can see. The first one, I'd just like to elaborate a little. Why this recent, how do we understand the recent upping the ante by the Trump administration? They had all the time in the world. Other than the trade war, nothing was made an issue of the way it has been made now. To the point of talking about regime change. But going to that point. But Huawei grew under their feet. Why was it allowed to? Or TikTok, they needed to wait for India to ban TikTok before the idea is tossed around. So what is this? Why are they in a hurry? And you see the constituency, the larger thing is US capital, as you mentioned, didn't have a problem with globalization. They were doing fine. It's the lower end of the US society where the problem is, and which is Trump's constituency, and which won't go away. Now, the recognition that globalization has not worked for that section of society has come to center stage. And that is why the Democrats also are not in a position to take a contra position. They have to keep that in mind. This is not going to go away, whoever wins. So how will this government of this factor, coming to the foregrounding of this factor, affect the China relations in the longer run, in the future? Thank you. That's
so great. Why now? Fine. Now we have one more question we'll take from somebody from the Nepal Policy Institute, Kedar. I think the name has been misspelled a bit, but Kedar Nupani, will you ask your question and please make it a short question? Well, again, I think he seems to have left also. But since it is a question from Nepal, let me put it to you, Raja. He says that recently Nepal produced a disputed map of Nepal, and now Pakistan has done with J&K. Does this action of the two neighbors reflect strengths of China pulling these countries away from India's sphere of influence, or India losing its grip on the regional situation? So maybe you can take these three and go to the next set.
Look, I think, on the Russia, US, China, look, I think this is not the Cold War where you say, look, I'm just with one guy. I don't think anybody is going to be with one side. So we have to engage all powers. And the key is not how much of distance are you keeping from the Americans and the Russians, but what are your interests? But your interests also because other powers are fighting with each other. It produces contradictions. And the problem is you have to deal with those contradictions. It's not, say, I'll just give you one example. Tillerson, first Secretary of State, came to Delhi 2016 or 2017 end and said, shut down your Korean mission, North Korea, you guys, we're going to take them on. So 4 months later, they said, Trump is saying, I love you, Kim Jong-un. So it is a fluid environment. So the first thing for us is not to define it in terms of principles, strategic autonomy, non-alignment. I was at a Catholic marriage to the Russians, so therefore, whatever happens, God can't separate the Catholic marriage. So I think, look, all of us have done different things at different times. I mean, Nehru went to Americans first, he went to the Russians. We signed an agreement with Russia in 1971. Today we buy a lot more weapons from the Americans. So I think it's a management thing. I mean, depending on the intensity of the contradiction, you try to navigate. I mean, so we're not a minor country that you have to simply accept that one power is saying, sorry, you can't do this. But sometimes when you calculate on the Iran vote, for example, in 2005, 2006, were you willing to sacrifice your nuclear deal for the sake of the Iranians? After all, the Iranians negotiated a deal themselves 10 years later, which was a very harsh deal. I mean, that was not good enough for the Republicans. That's a different story. So look, it's a management issue. It's not depending on the contradiction. So start with our own interests. How do we manage those? I think should be the main thing. On Saurabh, I think, look, why is the US upping it? See, look, I think, all countries like individuals, it's like you heard of the story of the frog in the, what, all you Chinese guys say, they put a frog in, slowly warming water. It tries to, by the time it realizes, look, it has got too hot, it can't get out because initially it is quite comfortable. So I think there is a path dependence of Sino-US normalization to deal with the Soviet Union, the expanding economic interaction in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and the need to deal with the global issue. But if you look at the last 10 years, after all, it is Obama administration that talked about the pivot to Asia. They didn't do much about it because the judgment that, look, they needed China to get their deal on the climate change, limited there on the economic side. So I think today, the internal equations within the US are changing. And that's why we have to watch very carefully what the Democrats are saying and what. So is the policy of 4 horsemen in the last few weeks in the administration, that is Attorney General, the FBI, the NSA, and the Secretary of State, is that a permanent position of Americans, or are there going to be modifications? We don't know at this point. So that's why I think it's good to see what the Democrats are saying and see how this plays out. So I think there again, it's a question of we need to constantly monitor and manage it. One view, in New York Times, they don't much like Trump, I believe. So they say these guys are trying to do things because they're losing the election. They want to make sure the next guy can't reverse it. I mean, that's one interpretation. But I think this problem is of path dependency, and at what point do you come out? Like take us, for example. Your debate today is same as the debate of 1962. So, but there we were for 30 years, multipolarity, RIC, BRICS, Asian solidarity. We were doing that. I mean, while you had unlike the Americans, we had a serious territorial issue. But we said, look, it all can be managed, or it can be, that's not big enough for me to do something on the economic side. But today, I think we joined AIIB, we've been partners, we've done things with them. Alka has run the RIC, we do all kinds of, from sports to Doordarshan to all with the Chinese and the Russians. So we have done things, so all countries do this, I think. But the question is, what they're doing, is it durable or not? And the answer you yourself have said is on how the internal contradiction plays out. So is the trade issue a big one? Then I think we'll have one set of considerations. But if Biden thinks, or Trump thinks, he can still get a deal from Xi Jinping, he'll moderate. So my main thesis is, look, for 30, 40 years, you had a tight economic bonding, but now the politics and the security considerations will make it less tight, will make it more, shall we say, a protracted contest rather than a clean slate that we saw last few years. Look, on Nepal, I mean, again, I think we shouldn't become a Christmas tree where we deal with everything under the sun. But look, but Nepal was doing this in 1960 as well. So it is not that, Nepal had always had issues with India. The so-called Friendship Highway, I don't know, Arnico Highway, when was it built? 60 or 61? After the 62 war, it opened up space for all our neighbors to play the China card. The degree to which they played, the degree to which we responded, that has varied. But they're teaching us non-alignment, right? So thank you for teaching us the virtues of non-alignment. But we'll deal with it, and India has to deal with it on its own economic strength and other assets or strengths it has in Nepal. So I think it's again, look, Nepal is sovereign. It can do exactly what it wants. But like every other case, when you do decisions, you'll have to live with them. I mean, that's only, you can't stop, nobody can stop tomorrow if Nepal decides set up a free trade agreement, dissolves its open border with India, throws out the security, the friendship, whatever, the 1950 treaty. Nepal is fully within its sovereign rights to do that. But there will be consequences for that. And the question is within Nepal and outside Nepal. So that's what is more interesting to me, and not, but the idea that Nepal is today doing something or playing India-China game, but that is an old one. What has happened is China is much stronger today. So there is a bigger economic play to it. In the past, it was just economic. It was simply political. You had Chinese that built the Karakoram Highway, 1976, Arnico Highway, 61. So BRI, might be a big story today, but as far as India was concerned, it saw the Chinese building links from Tibet, from Yunnan, from Xinjiang into South Asia and Burma. So that's an old story as far as we are concerned.
Okay, I'll go now to the hands which were raised, so I'll intersperse the raised hands in between. Prabir, you can come in first with your question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Acharya. Raja, my question is, and that is basically a very simple question. You brought out so many contradictions. Where do you see the Quad going? Do you see it has any future, or as per you, it will just take shape the way the seas make it navigate?
Thank you. Ambassador Yogendra Kumar? Looks like he's left as well. Partha?
No, I'm here. I'm very much here.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My question is regarding the RCEP and India's approach to it. I'm just wondering whether we are taking it more in abstruse geopolitical sense. When we talk about our relevance to the ASEAN and we want to be part of RCEP so that we can influence the geopolitics of the region, the fact of the matter is there's a question of how the ASEAN weighs our geopolitical heft. If the ASEAN isn't bothered to have us on board, to take into account our own concerns and considerations, that itself is a statement as far as geopolitical heft is concerned. So whether we are in or out of it, to that extent, somewhat irrelevant. So my point actually is that it is for the ASEAN in a way, perhaps the way the ASEAN takes decisions. It is actually for the ASEAN to make up its mind as to what it wants with India. Now, we have many other options. We can go past ASEAN and develop relations in other ways to try and see how we can shape the geopolitics of the South Asian region. Thank you.
Okay, and we'll take one more question from Partha.
Thanks, Ilka. Hi, Raja. I'm just following up in some sense on Alka's question about the elite fragment. And I'm trying to understand whether you see the elite fragmentation largely only in terms of economic interests, which you have been sort of foregrounding in this talk today, or do you see other axes of elite fragmentation? For example, in Indonesia, you do have religion as one of the possibilities given China's actions in Xinjiang. And related to that is the question about our own knowledge. I mean, our own knowledge about China is often discussed. But how good is our knowledge about these elites in various parts of Asia? You're now sitting in Singapore and you have sort of a more of an overview perhaps in where you are in Delhi. And it'd be useful to hear you sort of think about, sort of share your thoughts about where we stand in our knowledge about these elites and to the extent to which we can work with these fragmentations. Thank you.
Alka, you want me to come in?
Yeah, you take these three and then we'll go to the last one probably.
I think, this Quad is, we are so excited and, media and our discourse. Look, I think it's really a diplomatic instrument at this point. Since 2017, when it was revived, maybe 4 meetings for 45 minutes each, issuing a banal statement, which, separate statement. They didn't even issue a joint statement. But the kind of public interest in this as some kind of a sudden thing that we're going to do as a response to China, I think is highly overstated importance of Quad. But I would say, look, what India is doing with the US bilaterally is far more consequential, rather than a diplomatic, multilateral or plurilateral instrument that you want to do we've elevated it to the ministerial level. All that is diplomatic signaling. But the real stuff of actually, in terms of the current crisis that we have, is what we do bilaterally with the Americans. I think at least Indian media reports say there is lots of interesting things are happening. So I would go with that rather than I'm not, that's what I think, to use academics jargon, and over-valorizing the Quad at this point. It is work in progress. It has just begun. But there are times when things move quickly, like India. Really, very few knew that India was negotiating a security treaty with the Russians in 1971, when we signed it in August 71. So these things are pressure of the circumstances. So I think we should see that rather than the Quad itself as, on its own, is some kind of a hugely consequential thing that's going to change, because we have bilateral with all of them. We'll be doing some trilaterals with the Japanese and the Americans. So I would put more emphasis on the bilateral with the Americans rather than the Quad. It signals, I mean, tomorrow, if we do a Malabar exercise with Australians, okay, it's diplomatic signaling. The diplomats love the word signaling, but operationally, what the consequential thing for those on the border is really, is somebody giving us real-time intelligence? Yes, Americans are giving it. The only country to really publicly support us is the United States. I think that matters quite a bit, rather than what the Quad is going to do in the next few weeks or months. On ASEAN and RCEP, look, I think the Ambassador, Yogi, you're referring to the diplomatic argument. Look, if you looked at the NDA government's record, from the time they came to power, they said, we're going to review all the FTAs. That, in fact, they suspended negotiations on all of them. RCEP, yes, there were commitments made in the UPA government. They seem to continue. But in the end, look, it doesn't, what RCEP says here, please come even now. But you're still talking about, there is a negotiation, we'll make compromises. They need to open the door and put a, welcome to us. But look, I think in Delhi, the train has left the station on free trade. That's what Atmanirbhar means. That's what walking out of RCEP means. That's what digital strike against the Chinese companies means. So that we are taking a political decision, free trade of the kind that the 30 years between 1990 2014, that understanding of the value of trade is not acceptable to the current government, that it is focused on building your domestic capabilities, not opening your market to outsiders. On elite fragmentation knowledge, of course, there's never an end to knowledge. I mean, we can always do more. Look at the Americans. All their knowledge did not tell them anything. Americans are the best Arabists in the world. I mean, they couldn't get Iraq right or Iran right. They didn't get China right. In the end, now, a lot of Americans say, look, it was a mistake to have got the Chinese into the WTO. That it was a huge consequential transformation that has taken place. But then, look, I think you have normal channels to engage with these people. But are we, as research communities, we need to expand the capacity to study this different as a larger footprint today. We have a larger trade, we have larger security cooperation. So I think we need to invest in that, but we shouldn't keep looking at the government to do it. I mean, but as far as government is concerned, the embassies are trying to deal with different groups, different fragments of different elites. That's their business. That's what they're paid for.
All right. Now I'm going to take in a few questions from the younger lot before we. So if we make this crisp and to the point, then we can have two rounds. But let's start with Kishore. He's got just a one-line question. Kishore, spell it out. Hello. Okay, Kishore has, I think, left. His question was very simply, what is the Chinese vision of the post-COVID world order? And maybe that could be part of the kind of churning in the Asian geopolitics that you spoke about. Kanindra, I think your question has more or less been answered because it's once again dealing with Southeast Asia, ASEAN, RCEP. But he's more directly wanting to know whether it would weaken in all this decision to stay out and turn inwards and focus on internal development. He's saying, will it weaken India's image in ASEAN? Or will it cede more ground to China? So that's Kanindra's question. Kanhaiya, is Kanhaiya there?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, come on. Speak out your question.
So what measures can be taken to counter the sharp power which is exercised by China and Russia? Also, in what ways does it affect the geopolitics of the region?
Okay. So that's Kanhaiya. Then Neha, we have one question from Neha. Come on. Are you there, Neha?
No, I think she's left.
She's left. Well, I think it was an interesting India-China US trilateralism that her question was about. Let me put it out there because very few questions have really come up there. But her question is that USA's parallel de-alignment and realignment with India in the form of ending GSP status while continuing diplomatic. So GSP status to India while continuing diplomatic engagement in the form of Howdy Modi. Is it helping China in shaping Asian geopolitics, especially in economic terms or geoeconomics? Okay, Priya, your question? So Priya seems to have left also, and it's so we can then leave a question. So maybe you take these quickly, and then we'll have the senior participants. There are 3 of them whose questions can come in at the end.
See, look, whatever Chinese had ideas about post-COVID order, I mean, I think they seem to be on a big roll, and they sort the sense of a triumphal moment had come. But I think the pressure, the American pushback in WHO, on a whole range of issues since the pandemic has emerged, I'm sure the Chinese are reconsidering their own understanding of what the order could be, because the assumptions made in January this year, I'm sure Chinese are too realists. I'm sure they're also making a fresh assessment. We haven't seen Jabi Jan for a while in the spokesman's corner in the Foreign Office. The tone has changed. I mean, you talk about in the US, they're talking about, look, let's have an understanding. I'm sure they have an interest in dealing with the Biden administration. So I think it's a constant question of adaptation rather than So I think the pushback from the Americans opens up all basic questions. And I think that's where we are. So I think I would say watch that space rather than make judgments at this point. RCEP, look, ASEAN, India's image, look, the trade is about domestic economy. It's not about diplomacy. It's not about pleasing. I mean, it has to suit your economic interests. That the entire Indian industry was opposed to it. That you were a situation where manufacturing has disappeared, whether it was all the major industry groups were opposing it. So I think it's a question of what is your domestic economic strategy. I think this government has taken a call that the globalization of the kind that was pursued produced negative effects, and they need to compensate. So when they say today, we're going to do it in a different way and build national capabilities. Even the UPA government talked about the national manufacturing policy, but it didn't take off there. This time, my reading from what I see is, look, less globalization and more liberalization internally and strengthening the domestic capital that can deal with the outside world in a stronger fashion. I think that's my reading. I could be totally wrong. So there'll be less globalization, more domestic liberalization, and I think that's a change of course which is happening. Look, sharp power is, it's not just sharp power today. Everyone is talking about China's influence operations, how effective. I mean, these are all tricks. I mean, it goes back to the fundamental principles of statecraft. You try to influence the other society. Maybe in some cases, Chinese have gone too far. But I think the Chinese ability to use the publicly available means in the democratic societies, people are now reacting to it. So whether China will adapt and pull back, or whether it'll go the same way? We don't know. So again, I think it'll be quite an interesting thing to watch. I was listening to a Chinese diplomat who was saying, look, how they were under pressure in the recent years. So when you met somebody, you don't eat enough calcium. Why calcium? Because you don't have a stiff bone. We have risen, we go stand up and tell everybody where they get off. But diplomats know, look, doesn't work all the time. So probably there will be second thoughts on how they play this game outside. So I think my suspect it will change. Look, GSP, we are not in a relationship with the Americans where in the old days, the Indian embassy in Soviet Union said how many times did Gorbachev say great India? He's always going to say great India, whatever problems they had, because behind the closed doors, but publicly this constant praise of India, great India. Look, that way, it doesn't work like that. Look, Americans have trade problems with all their friends. With Japan, with China, with Europe, and sometimes look what Trump says Germany is worse than China. That doesn't mean US and Germany are not friends. So I think we have to see that trade is an issue between India and the US, and we have to manage it. How we manage it is depend on how your domestic economic policy is there. And the GSP was given at a time when it was developing countries. There's a strong argument in the US today. China and India are not developed, they've grown, so they shouldn't get these kind of benefits. But that's a political argument. In fact, if you read Lighthizer's piece in the Foreign Affairs latest issue, he talks about how India got this right at the beginning of GATT. Almost 70 years ago. So that was a mistake. So therefore we're not. So there are hawks there. And they're going to say, similarly on the H-1B visas. Unless we believe that every Indian engineer has a right to work in the United States, at least I'm from Andhra and most of my Andhra cousins think they have a right to go to the US. But would any country allow that? And I think there is a backlash too, that you have the Democrats, you have the Republicans saying, look, why are we getting in so many people into the US? That is one argument. But all the American companies say, look, I want the Indian engineers, they're cheap, a better labor I can get. So therefore there is a wage arbitrage I can do. So that's a tension between their society to play out. So I think just as we argue about ourselves, we argue internally, that there are arguments and that doesn't mean the relationship is kind of, so it's not just a single celebratory, all the time we are celebrating each other's virtues. So there are problems. But the fact is, India has the biggest trade relationship with the US, $160 billion, a $30 billion trade surplus. Now, that's a new reality. So how we deal with it, that's a different question.
Okay, now since we have come almost to the end of the session, I'm going to really just pick out the points of the question.
Please ask the senior people if they want to.
Yeah.
I have no problem for another 15 minutes.
No, because we're supposed to end this at 4:30. But let me, with your permission, Admiral Sinha, can I just read out your question? And there is one from Ambassador Bhaskar Balakrishnan. His question is, how do you see US-China relations under Biden presidency and a democratic-controlled Congress? And Admiral Sinha's was, do you see China-Iran bohemi become yet another issue in US-China relations? And Beam Subba has something which he thinks you may have an insider's view on this, but or information. But there is a rejuvenation of the China study group led by India's NSA. And do you see any other countries' inputs and participation apart from India's senior officials and experts? So maybe you can answer that. And finally, one more question about the maritime front, since you had written Samudra Manthan. This is from Vice Admiral Muralidharan, who says, can the Quad along with ASEAN powers check China trying to establish artificial islands and expand their maritime footprints? There's a last question about from Muhammad Intiqab Alam, who says, do you envisage a Cold War between US and China, given the increasing influence? There are a few more questions, but I think I'll just have to stop there because you've got about 2 to 3 minutes to just give one last kind of...
Okay. No, I think the Biden-China policy, I think that's why I think we should read what the manifesto has said. And there is a lot of debate in the US. The Democrats are divided too. So there is a left progressive section says, look, we should not get into a Cold War, which is what the platform says. At the same time, they say on trade, on human rights, they're going to take a tough position on the Chinese. On security issues, there is, I think, the deep state, as we said, is today far more critical of China, far more assertive, because if you see there is a continuity between Obama's pivot and Trump's contestation, so that could go in one direction. So I think the key is to see how these multiple contestations will play out, because what Biden has done, I believe, at least keep foreign policy out as much as possible from the left-wing pressure in the US. So whether they'll just simply go back to Obama-style policy or it's going to be open for fight. And it also depends, in the US, the president is not the sole power. That the Congress has already passed so many laws on Hong Kong and a whole range of issues. They're going to do more of that. Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, for example, I remember when Jyoti will remember, she came to Delhi to visit Dalai Lama. So there is strong support among the section of the Democrats to Taiwan, to Hong Kong, to Dalai Lama. So it's a problem with Americans is they all keep us work hard to figure out what is going on. So I think somebody said about studying other countries. I think we need to pay a lot of attention to the US, because at periods of change where it actually the needle might go is going to be very, very different from our assumptions of where the US is. So, but there is going to be a big fight on the China policy. And then you have the Googles and they love China, so they all want to go back and do as much business. So I think it will be a contestation, and how that contestation happens is worth watching. Look, Iran, China, I think Iranians are deeply nationalist. They're not going to hand over their country to the Chinese. This is a play for Biden, I think, because Biden has already said he'll come back into the nuclear deal. Trump is trying to snap back the sanctions. The Chinese might not support. So they will be a play till November. And what happens after that, we don't know. Meanwhile, today's Wall Street Journal has a story. While they're cozying up to Iran, they just built a uranium facility in Saudi Arabia. So that goes as well. My view, look, I think we tend to see Iran too much from Afghanistan, India, Chabahar perspective. All the other great powers, just as we have to manage the tension between the Sunni Gulf and the Shia Iran. You have to see multiple conflicts that are going on. So what happens to Chabahar is really relatively minor part. The real story as far as the rest of the world is, there is a big fight for the future of the Gulf. Saudis on one side, the Iranians on the other. And I think the dynamic, how that plays out, and the Israelis and the Gulf Arabs today are much closer. Qataris and the Turks are playing their own game. So there is a huge, messy struggles that are going on. And I think India should also look at the region in a broader sense and not, be too anxious that, New York Times has put out a story. If you read the second paragraph of that story, what is the New York Times saying? Oh, see, this stupid Trump has driven Iran into the Chinese arms. That's that's editorial. That's not a news report. So I think it's, again, this is something that will play out in the coming weeks. I think we have to see, I think the Chinese role and weight in the Middle East as a whole, and in the Gulf in particular, is dramatically risen. Chinese digital companies have set up shop in a big way in Abu Dhabi and other places. They're taking a big role in the construction of a new city that Prince Mohammed wants to build in a place called Neom. So I think there's a huge amount of Chinese activity that's going on in the Middle East, in the Gulf in particular. I think we need to take a full picture of that rather than one New York Times report and all of us are, really going crazy about it. CSG rejuvenation, I'm sure you can ask Ambassador Nambiar is sitting there, former Deputy National Security Advisor, and he can tell you what might be going on, but I have no, sitting so far away in Singapore, I have no sense of the bureaucratic dynamic inside. On the islands, look, I see, look, this is my view, we should focus on strengthening, our islands first, before joining others to, build. Americans can do that. Japanese can do that. They don't need us to, sail with them in the South China Sea. They got enough capability. Our strategy, I think, in the near term should be strengthen the positions that we have in Andamans, strengthen our positions in Lakshadweep, work closer with the Western Indian Ocean Islands, where we already have engagement. So I would say consolidate our Indian Ocean presence rather than thinking of going there to play the big game. The Americans are still quite capable. They just moved 2 aircraft carriers. They're pushing back. So we don't need to be there. I think we need to strengthen ourselves. Finally, I mean, just as a conclusion, so I think it is a definitive moment in global politics. I think that's what we need to understand. The post-90 assumptions of the global economic order, the post-90 assumptions about great power harmony, the post-90 assumption of how China will behave, how Americans will behave. Those all 3 are breaking down. So we are in a fundamentally different context. A context, if I might take a bit of a soaring rhetoric here, I mean, like in 1941-42, when the great power relationship took a fundamental turn, in those 4 years, there were ups and downs, people switched sides. We didn't get that right. Then you had our assessment of the China evolution after the war, and then you had 1970s. I remember how much, Ambassador Nambiar will know, 76, when we were in JNU, when Mr. Narayanan was going back as ambassador, the Russians were putting so much noise saying, look, why are you normalizing relationship with China? Then when Gorbachev came here, we were asking the Russians, why are you rushing into a normalization with the Chinese? So I think there was a twist in the 80s when Gorbachev normalized relationship with China. Americans were already building strength. So today, we are at a different point. That like 41-42, like 71-72, like 1991, we are at a fundamentally different moment in great power relations. We're also at a fundamental moment in the economic situation in the world. This is a whole new set of demands is going to make. Just as in 1990, we rethought our foreign policy, foreign economic policy. I think the demands on us are going to be how do we do that at the same time as dealing with the huge crisis on our frontiers in the north and in the northwest. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, and we have to stop this webinar now. Just remains for me to thank Raj for a very, very interesting and a very thought-provoking talk. As the wise guru once said, the problem with the world order is that it is not much of an order. And so what you have helped us do is really make some sense out of this order in the disorder and try and what you're talking, my takeaway is really that what we need to do is carefully study and analyze these structural changes that are taking place and what are the possibilities that are coming out from these great transformations, from this moment of transition, and formulate our policy in accordance with one's interests. So that's really what. So to those who had asked questions, but I could not bring them in, I can only say that because it's such a dynamic issue, Raj will be back with us. Maybe after the US elections, he will come and enlighten us further on various issues. But my apologies to you all, and my thanks to the speaker and to our media partners, ThePrint. And thank you all participants for making this such a lively and interesting webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Olga. Thank you for having me.